Shalom, shalom, shalom. This is Daniel John Lee with Torah Restoration Ministries. Website is www.spiritandtorah.com. I made 3 videos the other night about called Donald Trump, Prophetic Timeline, and Yah's Return, and I realized I had an error. I had something wrong, and just like Yah expects us, when we find an error, we're supposed to correct it and change it to conform to reality, and that's how we're supposed to live our spiritual lives as well as just everyday life. I had to do the same. So I'm going to leave those 3 videos up because there's a lot of background information that is correct and true that I want to keep in those videos, and so I'm still going to encourage people to watch those first 3 videos. But I'm going to put this up as a kind of a 4th addendum or correction. So I had looked at Wikipedia, and they said that the Temple of Concord was built in 7 AD. Turns out Wikipedia was wrong because almost every other historical source says it was constructed in 7 BC. That's when the construction began, but then it was finally completed in 10 AD, okay, and then it was rededicated in 12 AD. So they had that wrong, and it was an error in Wikipedia. Just goes to show you can't always trust Wikipedia, but all the other sources showed that it was actually the construction began back in 7 BC, finished about 10 AD, and then 2 years later in 12 AD it was rededicated or dedicated for the last time. Temple of Concord. So go back and watch those 3 videos if you haven't, because there's a lot of background information that's important to understand how I'm going to correct things for you to understand this timeline. Okay? So, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to change things up here. So we have the temple being finally finished, but rather than it being in 780, it's actually finished being built in 1080. Which is interesting. I'm making all these corrections in blue, color of heaven. Okay? What's interesting is that now we have 7 years, 10 AD, and then when Yahshua rose again, the Jubilee, put a big J there for the Jubilee, it's in 17 AD. And again, go watch the last 3 videos to understand why. So 7 years here. So this is when the Temple of Concord, that's depicted in the orange, okay, is finally finished construction. And here we have the blood of Yahshua in red, and someone praising Yah because Yahshua rose. 7 years later in 17 AD. Now, here's what's interesting. According to that same encyclopedia and the other sources that I saw, after that Temple of Concord was finished, it was rededicated about 2 years later. So it took about 2 years later for it to be rededicated. So 12 AD. Okay? Now remember, Yahshua had a 3.5-year ministry. He was crucified and rose again in Passover, which was spring of 17. And then he walked with the disciples in his resurrected body for the next 40 days. And then, of course, 10 days later, to finish out that 50-day Omer, from first fruits and Passover to Shavuot, the Ruach HaKadosh fell upon the disciples. So that his ministry on earth ended in the spring of 2017. Or excuse me, of spring of 17. So, which means that his 3.5 years back starts in the fall of 13 AD. So you go back from the spring of 17, you come to the fall, right here, of 13 AD, which is when Yahshua's ministry began. Okay? Now, we have a perfect mirror image once again, but it has to change over here too because this stuff changed. So now we're going to go back and see what the mirror image, remember that menorah, how you have 3 and 3 in the servant candle, so you have these mirror pictures all through Scripture. Now we're going to see the mirror of this. Watch this. So now we come to 2017, which is also a Jubilee. And again, go watch those original 3 videos to know why. 2017, the Jubilee, okay? And then, we gotta redo all this stuff here. Just want to erase it. Now, Trump, I think, is going to win the election, okay? And I made in those first 3 videos a lot of comparisons between Trump's presidency and the Temple of Concord and the similarities between the 2. Trump has said it's going to take about 2 years for that wall to be built on the southern border. So we'll put that out 2 years from 2017, which will be about 2019 when the wall's built. And also, in this Jubilee, it's very likely that Trump, through both a mixture of diplomacy and war, will allow the Jews to have their temple construction built. And it can take 2 years to also dedicate it in 2019. Okay? Now, If you go 7 years out from 2017, you come 2024. Okay? That's 7 years. Just as you had now, not 10, but 7 years. Between 10 AD, when that Temple of Concord first was finished, and Yahshua rising from the dead in that Jubilee. You have 2 years gap between 2017 and 2019 for that wall to be built, for the temple to be built and dedicated. You have a 2 year gap between 10 AD when the Temple of Concord was finished and it's rededicated in 12 AD. In the midst of the 7 years, 2017 to 2024, you come to 2021. The spring of 2021 to be exact. Spring of 2021. Now watch this. We've got 10 AD and 17 AD. 7 years. We've got 2017 and 2024. 7 years. We got a 2 year gap between 10 and 12 AD when the temple is finally finished and finally rededicated. We've got a 2 year gap between 2017 and 2019 when the wall is finally finished on our southern border of the United States, when the temple will be rededicated as well after being built hopefully in 2017. Then you have Yahshua's ministry beginning in the fall of 13 AD, 3.5 years before 17. And you have the Antichrist's wicked ministry beginning in the spring of 2021. 3.5 years later, you come to 2024. The end of the Antichrist's ministry when Yahshua returns for his bride on Yom Teruah, the fall feast. It's a perfect mirror image. You have Yahshua rising again in the Jubilee. You have Yahshua returning in 2024, 7 years after the Jubilee. It's a perfect mirror image. Jubilee, Jubilee. 3.5 years back, Yahshua starts his ministry in 13 AD. 3.5 years forward, the Antichrist has his ministry from spring of 2021 to fall of 2024. You have a 2 year gap between the Temple of Concord being built and the Temple of Concord being dedicated. You have a 2 year gap between Trump taking office, building the wall, negotiating in Israel, and 2019 when that temple is finally dedicated in Israel. And remember, this temple in Israel is going to be a false temple. This temple is not going to be sanctified by Yah. It's going to be polluted by the Anti-Messiah. And in fact, the scripture says that Jerusalem, although it will be exalted like Mount Zion in the millennial kingdom, during the time of the end it will be spiritually as Sodom and Egypt. It's also the place where the 2 witnesses will be murdered. Now what's really sobering about this is that rather than Trump having 2 full terms, he has 1 term. He gets elected in the fall of 2016, which again, go watch those other 3 years to learn about how that plays in with the Trump being blown the year before a Jubilee, in that Shemitah of Shemitah year's 49th year. But he starts his, office. He starts being the president in January of 2017. And then he has a re-election in 2020, in the fall of 2020, and he starts his office in January of 2021, would just be a few months before the spring of 2021 when the Antichrist would start. So does this mean Trump's only going to have 1 term? And then things are going to, and we'll have that revival like I talked about in the previous 3 videos, that incredible revival, but then it gets corrupted. And Trump's not able to have his 2nd term because now this evil comes in worldwide. It'll be interesting to see what happens, but I think that this now completely matches both historically and has a perfect mirror. So again, you can take this to Yah, and you can pray about it and study it, and go to history and just read about it. I'll post some more links under this video as well, the historical links. But I think it's pretty compelling at this point that that's what looks like is going to happen. Again, remember, watch those first 3 videos that I made first, even though there's some error in it with the specific dates. Watch those first 3 videos to get a lot of the background, and then this will all make a lot more sense. I'll provide links to those first 3 videos as well below this video. Okay, shalom, shalom. This is Daniel John Lee with Torah Restoration Ministries. It's now the 5th day of Ziph, and happens to be the 5th day of the week as well. Ziph is the 2nd Hebrew month, and this is the month that the foundation of the temple was laid, so it's appropriate that we're talking